So good afternoon and welcome to the next conference in our series, Leuven Colloquia on Ancient Platonism. And it's a special pleasure for us today to have Professor Riccardo Chiaradonna from Roma here in our midst. As everyone knows, Professor Chiaradonna is one of the most renowned, probably the most renowned specialist of Plotinus, with several books on Plotinus, an early book about which I think he will talk today also a bit, Sostanza, Movimento, Analogia, Plotino Critico di Aristotele. He also published not so long ago an introduction to Plotinus in Italian, which is actually much more than an introduction. It is a discussion with all the current scholarship on the most, let's say, essential problems of the interpretation of Plotinus. And apart from that, he has published numerous articles on various philosophers, among whom, of course, Plotinus. And today he will talk to us about Plotinus on physical motion. To the people online, I would like to remind them that this meeting will be recorded. So if you feel uncomfortable with your image being shown, please kill your camera and microphone, of course. Without further ado, I give the floor to Riccardo Chiaradonna.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank my friend Jan Solmer for having me here. I'm really happy to be involved in this wonderful project. Thank you very much. And well, there is a handout. I think, I hope you have that. And I think it's in the chat for those who are online. Well, my paper will basically focus on Plotinus' discussion of physical motion in his treatise 6.1, the first part of his discussion on the genera of being. In Plotinus' treatises on the genera of being, Plotinus actually deals very extensively with motion. In 6.1, the first treatise, Plotinus critically addresses Aristotle's categories of acting and being acted upon, poiein and paskein, and within this framework, he takes issue with Aristotle's view of motion as an incomplete activity, energeia ateles, Physics 3.2. Then in the second treatise, 6.2, Plotinus focuses on intelligible motion as one of the genera which constitute the basic structure of the intellect. So these are, of course, being, motion, res, sameness, and difference, as Plotinus argues, drawing on Plato's Sophist. Motion is now characteristically associated with the intellect's life and activity. Finally, in the third treatise, Plotinus returns to physical motion in outlining his own account of the genera in the sensible realm. Motion is now one of the sensible genera, and the discussion in 6.3 relies on the previous criticism of Aristotle in 6.1, while introducing further elements. Here, so in 6.3, Plotinus describes motion in bodies as an awake form, which is opposed to other forms which are static, and he describes motion as perpetual otherness. My main focus will be the first part of Plotinus' discussion, that is, his critical discussion of Aristotle in 6.1. In 6.1.15, Plotinus argues that poiein acting, so Plotinus aims to show that poiein and paskein can be traced back to kinesis. This is more or less what he is aiming to show. So he first argues that acting, poiein, means being in some action, poiesis. That action is nothing else than activity, energeia, and that this being the case, the motion of beings is one single genus, en genos e kinesis ton onto. So this is the very first part of Plotinus' argument, aiming to show that poiein can be traced back to motion. after this third part, at the very beginning of 6.1.16, that's the first text in your handout, Plotinus considers a remark that is apparently intended to block the progression from acting to action to activity to motion as a single genus. As Plotinus says, but if someone were to say that motion is an incomplete activity, and so on. Eidetis legoi ten kinesin atele energeia, and so on. Well, of course, this sentence is an obvious quotation from Aristotle's Physics, Book 3, Chapter 2. That's the second text in your handout. And the role of this remark here is sufficiently clear. Because if motion as such is not an activity in the full sense, but only an incomplete activity, so a qualified sort of activity insofar as it is a defective or incomplete one, then if this is the case, then the progression from energeia to kinesis cannot hold. We cannot trace back energeia to kinesis because kinesis is not energeia in the full sense. Some preliminary remark. Plotinus, in this part of the discussion, Plotinus aims not so much to replace Aristotle's definition with a different one. This is what happens later in 6.3. Rather, in the first part of his discussion, Plotinus aims to reinterpret Aristotle's words in a way which is both at odds with Aristotle's account and compatible with Plotinus' own views. Plotinus, therefore, starts his argument suggesting that Aristotle's definition may be taken as a definition per genus et differentiam, meaning that motion is an activity in the full sense, in the same way as, for example, dogs or horses are animals in the full sense, and in addition, motion is incomplete. In other words, incomplete would act as a specific differentia that determine within the genus activity the species motion. If this is the case, motion would not be incomplete insofar as it is an activity. In other words, energeia and ateles would refer to two different features of motion, and ateles would not express any qualification about motions being an energeia. Well, of course, this is, at the first glance, a very weak argument. And you have, for example, text number 3, which is a passage from Simplicius. There you have Iamblichus' polemical remark against Plotinus. Iamblichus, of course, remarks that this is a distorted way of making sense of Aristotle's definition, because, of course, Aristotle regards motion as a nature different from activity in the full sense. As Iamblichus says, if motion departs into a different genus, activity cannot be its genus. In other words, it is, of course, misleading to regard incomplete as having the same status as, say, biped or other specific differentiae, because ateles qualify the very status of energeia. Therefore, against what Plotinus suggests, motion cannot be a species of activity. Well, Iamblichus' remark is certainly true, but it is hard to see how Plotinus could be unaware of this fact. So it's hard to see how Plotinus could be unaware that ateles qualifies the very status of activity. I would suggest that in order to make sense of this chapter, it is crucial to make clear from the outset that Plotinus does not aim to follow Aristotle or to interpret his words faithfully. What Plotinus aims to do instead is to develop an internal criticism which takes Aristotle's views, motion is incomplete activity, as its starting point, while setting out from Aristotle's views and adopting them as a framework for the whole argument. Plotinus actually develops a position that is meant to supersede Aristotle's original theory. In so doing, he incorporates Aristotle's concepts and vocabulary in order to convey a meaning which ultimately goes beyond the original one and is connected to Plotinus' own views. I would suggest that the reinterpretation of the Energeia Ateles formula as a definition per genus et differentiam should be taken not as a gross misunderstanding of Physics 3.2, but as the first step of Plotinus' distinctive polemical argument. Plotinus contends that motion as such is an energeia in the full sense, which also has the feature of occurring over and over again, aka topalin kai palin, as you can see in the first text of the handout, line 6. The progression from energeia to kinesis is therefore legitimate. If motion is incomplete, this does not affect, in other words, its status as an activity in the full sense. In fact, Plotinus suggests that the attribute incomplete refers not to motion as such, but to the extended process which remains incomplete, not achieved, until the end is reached. That's what Plotinus calls to pragma ou estokazeto at line 9. For example, walking, badisis, can be analyzed in two ways. In itself, walking is an activity, and the activity of walking is complete from the start, and at every moment it takes place. Hence, it is independent of time, and in this precise sense, Plotinus says that motion as an activity is not in time and achrono. On the other hand, walking a certain distance remains incomplete until the whole distance has been covered. This is what Plotinus describes as a given quantity of walking, as opposed to the activity of walking as such. I will now read some lines from this argument. If one had to traverse a stadium and had not yet arrived at the point of having traversed it, what was lacking would not belong to walking or motion, but to a certain quantity of walking. So some 20 years ago, I published a book, and there I suggested that here Plotinus distinguishes two levels of motion, or rather, two motions which are related as cause and effect. According to my old interpretation, the motion that is said to be activity in the full sense and is not in time would act as an internal dynamic cause of the extended motion that we perceive and which stretches across time in the sensible world. Actually, the motion, even if Plotinus does not mention the soul within this context, because his focus is the criticism of Aristotle's definition and not the full explanation of his own view. A number of friends and colleagues, for example, A.F. Emerson and Christopher Noble, have shown that this interpretation, so my own interpretation, is problematic. And I think they are right. And I would refer to their contribution for a persuasive criticism of my previous view. You have a quotation from an article by Chris Noble in your handout. There he outlines his own reading, according to which motion as such and extension of motion are not related as cause and effect, but are basically two different descriptions of the same phenomenon. So it's not so much a distinction between a cause and what the cause brings about, but two ways of describing motion in bodies. Well, my reading especially relied on Plotinus' use of the verb ergazestai at line 8, ergazetai or heteron esti metauten, as you can see in the handout. So motion as an activity in the full sense brings about something which is another thing subsequent to itself. I took these words to refer to the causal power of incorporeal motion in bringing about the subsequent and posterior extended motion of bodies. And it is true that elsewhere in the general of being, Plotinus makes use of this verb, ergazestai, in order to convey this meaning. For example, the former principle brings about forms in bodies. So there is this parallel. According to this reading, we might be inclined to regard motion as an incorporeal activity, which is the productive cause, ergazetai, of the extended motion posterior to it, according to Plotinus' characteristic view of the double activity. Motion as such would be the first or internal activity, while extended motion would be the external activity flowing from it as a byproduct and in virtue of its very nature. I think now that this reading is hardly plausible, as shown by Plotinus' further remark that when the activity brings about the subsequent thing, it is not itself brought to completion, lines 8-9, but the thing it was aiming at. Uk aute teleiutai tote alato pragma u estochazeto. According to my old interpretation, these words would actually suggest that the external activity is that at which the primary activity aims. Note the verb stochazestai. But this conflicts clearly with Plotinus' standard view that the primary activity is complete and self-contained, so that in itself it does not aim at something external to it. For example, the former principle brings about the form in bodies, but the former principle does not aim at bringing about the form. The corporeal form is not the telos of its activity. I think that there is a precise reason why Plotinus makes use here of ergazestai. We shall see that later on in my paper. But I think that it's very problematic to regard this verb as expressing the causal power of a primary activity for the very simple reasons that the product cannot be regarded as the telos of the primary activity. So I'm inclined to regard my previous interpretation as wrong. Well, as a matter of fact, Plotinus focuses on the causes of physical motion in 6.3. So, to make things clearer, my previous view was that Plotinus is here outlining a distinction between a causal motion, the energeia, and its product, the extended motion. I think that there are serious arguments against this reading, and I'm inclined to think that Plotinus is here simply describing two ways of making sense of motion in bodies. We can describe the same phenomenon as an activity in itself, the activity of walking, or as something incomplete until the end is reached, walking a certain distance. Because as a matter of fact, Plotinus certainly focuses on causes of physical motion, but that's the focus of 6.3. And that's not the focus of 6.1. Then, in 6.3, Plotinus characterizes motion in bodies as an activity that derives from an incorporeal power. This approach, the approach in 6.3, supplements and completes the inquiry in 6.1, where the discussion merely describes the structure of physical motion and does not focus on its causes. If we adopt a modern vocabulary, we might say that the critical discussion in 6.1, the discussion of Aristotle in 6.1, focuses on cinematics, whereas the inquiry on genera in the sensible realm in 6.3 supplements cinematics with dynamics. The reference to incorporeal causes pertains to dynamics, that is to 6.3, and not to 6.1. Plotinus' account in 6.1 then describes motion rather than causally explaining it. And as a matter of fact, Plotinus says that we can provide a twofold description of motion. On the one hand, motion in bodies is an activity in the full sense, which has the over and over again, topalin, kaipalin. On the other hand, motion in bodies is a certain quantity of motion. For example, a certain extent of walking through a stadium. Here I would first elucidate the status of the Plotinus description of motion as such. Energeia men pantos eche to palin kai palin. Whereas Aristotle emphasizes that motion is an essentially incomplete activity, Plotinus emphasizes that motion is an activity in the full sense, and this justifies the view that motion is a single genus. Why eche to palin kai palin? What does this precisely mean? It's a very enigmatic expression. Here you can see in your handout after T5, a passage from Miles Burnet's celebrated article on kinesis and energeia. We will come back on this article later on. There, Burnet suggests that palin kai palin means that motion is extended in time. So Plotinus would suggest that motion is extended through time. I'm inclined to disagree because in this chapter, when Plotinus wants to say that motion is extended in time, he simply says that motion is enchrono. So there is no reason to adopt such a strange formula to palin kai palin to convey a very simple sense, and Plotinus is perfectly capable to see that what is in time is in time. It doesn't need to say that it occurs palin kai palin. I think that I would suggest that being palin kai palin refers, by the way, what is enchrono, according to Plotinus, is not motion as such, is the extent of motion. Motion as such is independent of time. And I am inclined to think that the words palin kai palin are precisely meant to express this nuance, i.e., motion as a complete activity occurs in time, but while occurring in time, it does not need time because its nature is independent of the time in which it occurs. And I think that the parallel, this parallel has long been noticed by scholars, is with Aristotle's Physics, Book 5. You have this text in your handout. Both Aristotle and Alexander of Rhodesius mention the formula palin kai palin in order to describe circular, cyclical motion. So I think that Plotinus is here adopting this view, which was a typical way to refer to cyclical motion in the peripatetic tradition. Of course, when Plotinus adopts this formula in order to characterize the activity of working, it doesn't want to suggest that the activity of working is circular. That's not Plotinus' aim. But the parallel with cyclical motion is revealing nonetheless. Aristotle contrasts cyclical motion with rectilinear motion. So for example, he contrasts rolling and walking. Because rectilinear motion entails change from one place to another, whereas in cyclical motion, the beginning and the end are the same. And a cycle is complete when it has returned to its starting point. So the same process can go on and on indefinitely. What matters in Aristotle's use of palin kai palin is recurrence or iteration. And iteration is possible because cyclical motion is not from here to there, so to speak, but as Aristotle says, from the same to the same. This, I would suggest, is the relevant fact which explains why Plotinus adopts the formula palin kai palin. His point is that motion as such, motion as the description of physical motion as a complete activity, sees motion as taking place in time, of course, but while being in time, its status does not depend on time. In itself, motion is not directed towards an end state external to itself. It is fully present at every moment, and there is no upper and lower limit to the time it may occupy. So as such, motion simply goes on over and over again. And I think that Armstrong's translation of palin kai palin is perfectly correct. Note that Aristotle opposes the status of walking, rectilinear motion, to that of rolling, because rolling changes again and again from the same to the same, whereas for other types of motion, the start and end state are different. Plotinus, interestingly, and maybe somewhat ironically, applies Aristotle's characterization of rolling to the activity of walking itself, insofar as this activity is regarded independently of the extent of walking accomplished by the object. So I think there is some kind of ironical reference to Aristotle. Well, when characterizing walking as a motion in the full sense, Plotinus makes another allusion to Aristotle's physics. It's a very interesting allusion. You find in lines 12, 13. More precisely, Plotinus refers to the passage in Physics Book 6, where Aristotle contends that there is no first instant of time in which change occurs, because change is a continuum and is infinitely temporally divisible into sub-changes. Therefore, as Aristotle says, that's T8 in your handout, it is evident that everything that is in motion must have been in motion before. Phaneron oti panto kinumenon ananche che kinestai proteron. Plotinus applies more or less the same words to walking. It was already walking, however short the walk was, and motion. For certainly, the man who is in motion has already moved, and the man who is cutting, cut already. Badesis then, kai oposeun, kai kinesis ede, ogun kinumenos, kai ede ke kinetai, kai otemnon ede eteme. Very interestingly, here Plotinus modifies the original sense of Aristotle's formula. By paraphrasing Physics 6:6, Plotinus contends that motion is complete, whatever the extent of the motion accomplished may be, and therefore independently of the time in which a given quantity of motion takes place. In other words, Plotinus interprets Aristotle's use of the perfect in the physics, which is a standard stative resultative perfect. So an action performed in the past, which stands complete at the present tense. So that's the standard meaning of the perfect in Aristotle's passage. Well, Plotinus interprets this use of perfect but he makes some kind of alteration because his quotation implies that motion is fully present or complete from the start at every moment in which it occurs. In other words, pleasant plus perfect in Plotinus do not refer to anteriority, but to the fact that motion is completely achieved, however short is the time in which it takes place. Two features are interesting. The first is Plotinus' rephrasing of Aristotle. It is crucial that proteron, which we find in the physics, is replaced with ede in Plotinus. So Plotinus replaces the adverb proteron with the adverb ede. And this is not incidental, because Plotinus generally uses ede to express not anteriority, but completeness. Ede is a signature in Plotinus' accounts of the intelligible word. What is already there is completely and wholly there, independently of any process in time. There are countless parallels for this use of ede. You have T9, for example, which is a passage from 6.2, where Plotinus' use of ede showing completeness and independence of time is very clear. When applied to the physical motion, to natural motion, ede does not indicate that physical motion is outside time, as motion in nous, but rather that motion as such is independent of time. So that is whole and complete at every moment. In other words, by using ede, Plotinus lends some kind of aspectual meaning to the verbs kekinetai and eteme. The aspectual meaning indicating completeness is not conveyed through the verbs themselves, but through the adverb ede, replacing the Aristotelian proteron. By the way, by Plotinus' time, all the specific connotation of the perfect were lost. You can see that Plotinus makes use of perfect and aorist as perfectly interchangeable tenses. So in a sense, Plotinus simply regarded the perfect as a past tense, but the ede gives this specific connotation of completeness. Well, these lines in Plotinus have been the focus of a celebrated discussion in Miles Burnier's article on kinesis and energeia. Here we have to focus on Plotinus' Aristotelian background. According to Miles Burnier, this chapter clearly shows that Plotinus was not aware of Aristotle's account of kinesis and energeia in the end section of Metaphysics 9.6, text 7 in your handout, what Burnier calls the passage. So according to Miles Burnier, this chapter in Plotinus clearly shows that Plotinus was not aware of this passage in the Metaphysics, and that's very important because the textual status of these lines is controversial, and Burnier regards them as a late Byzantine insertion into the text of the Metaphysics, originally stemming from one of Aristotle's lost ethical works. Well, the distinctive feature of Metaphysics 9.6, the last part of this chapter, is that kinesis and energeia are regarded as parallel and exclusive species of the genus praxis. Within this framework, Aristotle contends that unlike motions, activities satisfy some kind of a verbal text. Doing something is an activity if and only if from the present tense X is doing something, we may infer X as done. If we may not infer the perfect from the present, then we have a kinesis. The examples of activities satisfying the verbal test include seeing and understanding. The examples of motions not satisfying the test include learning, building, and walking. Well, when interpreting these lines from the Metaphysics, Burnier argues extensively that the perfects in these lines do not express tense, but aspect. That's a somewhat controversial conclusion, but that's the main point in Burnier's analysis. More precisely, Aristotle's point is not that, for example, seeing entails having seen at the prior time, but that seeing is or can be wholly present with no past reference at all. Note that both in the physics and in the metaphysics, Aristotle makes use of the present and perfect couple. The thing is that in the physics, the present plus perfect couple is meant to show anteriority. What is in motion now has been already moving before. In the metaphysics, we have instead the idea of completeness. Of course, according to Burnier, it is true that the perfect in the metaphysics means aspect and not tense, but it's also true that we have two different adverbs. In the physics, we have proteron. In the metaphysics, we have hama. So the two adverbs, independently on the thorny issues about the tense or aspect sense, convey a different sense in the two passages. So when Aristotle says noeikainen noenoiken in the metaphysics, is using the perfect in order to convey this sense of being complete, which is of course different from the stative resultative perfect coupled with proteron, which we find in physics 6.6. Well, among Burnier's arguments against Plotinus' acquaintance with Metaphysics 9.6, among his arguments, Burnier mentions Plotinus' unawareness of the verbal test for activities. Nowhere does he allude to the relation of present and perfect tenses. That's what Burnier says. One wonders whether such a statement is justified. Because as we can see, Plotinus makes reference to the present and verbal test when he says the man who is in motion has already moved, and the man who is cutting, cut already. So from this very naive point of view, Plotinus makes use of the present and perfect tense. Of course, Plotinus' source in this passage is not the metaphysics. Plotinus' source is the physics. The parallel with the physics is very clear. That said, it is very important that Plotinus paraphrases the physics in order to convey a sense which is close to the metaphysics, to what we find in the metaphysics. In other words, it is certainly true that the source for the words okinumenos kai ede ke kinetai is not metaphysics 9.6, but physics 6.6, but it's also perfectly true that Plotinus applies these words complete energeiai to full energeiai, so to his motion insofar as his motion as such. Furthermore, Plotinus' use of ede to indicate that the motion is whole and complete from the start and at every moment conveys a meaning which is surprisingly similar to the aspectual meaning of the perfect in Metaphysics 9.6. So we have two different explanations. Two different explanations are possible. First explanation, Plotinus doesn't know Metaphysics 9.6. He simply paraphrases Physics 6.6 in order to convey a sense which is not the sense in Aristotle's physics, but is his own sense. In doing so, he modifies the sense of the passage in the physics so that this sense comes surprisingly closer to the metaphysics passage Plotinus didn't know. Another possible explanation is that Plotinus was aware of both passages, and that is, so to speak, interpreting Aristotle ironically. In a sense, he starts from the physics passage, he replaces proton with ede, and in doing so, he gives to this passage a sense which is close, which is basically the same sense as that we find in metaphysics as referred to activity. So that would be some kind of ironical use of Aristotle against himself. I don't think we can opt for one of these solutions. In other words, I don't think that we can use this passage in order to show that Plotinus certainly knew Metaphysics 9.6, but we cannot, contra Berniat, use this passage in order to demonstrate that Plotinus wasn't certainly aware of this passage. We have to suspend judgment. I am personally inclined to think that Plotinus, it would be consistent with Plotinus' general attitude, this ironical quotation of the physics. And Plotinus is saying, look, Aristotle, I'm quoting your words about motion. I only have to replace an adverb and then have your characterization of complete activity, which you sharply distinguish from motion elsewhere. I'm inclined to think that this is the case. Certainly, I don't think we can point to Plotinus' chapter in order to show that Plotinus wasn't certainly aware of Metaphysics 9.6. In the last part of my paper, I would now come back to the verb ergazetai, because I'm convinced that I was wrong 20 years ago. Still, I'm trying to understand why I was wrong. So I'm now discussing my former self, so to speak. And I think that the verb ergazetai is very ambiguous because, of course, the verb ergazetai suggests that the activity in itself brings about something else. Well, I think that if we read these lines, there is a striking feature in Plotinus' way of expressing these views. We find no reference to the thing in motion. If you come back to Aristotle's definition of motion in Physics 3.2, text 2 in your handout. Then you have motion is thought to be a sort of activity but incomplete. The reason for this view being that the potential whose activity it is incomplete. As a matter of fact, the second part of Aristotle's definition of motion cannot be found in Plotinus. Plotinus quotes Aristotle in a truncated way. And I think that this very cryptic and synthetic way of paraphrasing Aristotle explains why Plotinus doesn't say that motion is an activity of the thing in motion, and that through its activity, the thing in motion brings about something. That would be what we would expect from this passage. So the motion is an activity of something, of the moving thing, of the thing in motion, and through its activity, for example, through the activity of walking, the thing in motion brings about something. For example, the thing in motion attains a certain end. Plotinus doesn't mention the thing in motion for the for a long time. As a matter of fact, he mentions the things in motion for the first time when he paraphrases the physics passage. In the first part, the thing in motion is simply not there. And there is another interesting situation. The thing in motion is the dunaton in Aristotle. If we read the whole section on movement in 6.1, there is no reference, apart from a short reference in chapter 17, there is no reference to dunamis or dunaton. Those two words are simply missing in Plotinus' account in 6.1, whereas they play a crucial role in Plotinus' account in 6.3. And of course, to duname is standard Plotinian vocabulary. So there must be some reason why to dunaton and the potentiality do not occur in 6.1. It's not, I think, a mere coincidence that Plotinus, in a sense, misquotes Aristotle's definition. I think that Plotinus deliberately removes the reference to the dunaton here. And I think that this is the reason why his expression is very cryptic, and this lends the impression that the activity brings about something, because there is no reference to the thing in motion. Why so? I mean, I will not delve into Aristotle's definition of motion and into the intricacies of this very complicated definition. I would suggest that there is a precise reason why we don't find any reference to dunaton here. Why so? Because we have to go back to the very beginning of 6.1 chapter 3, which is text 10 in your handout. There Plotinus presents a number of arguments to show that Aristotle's account of physical substance includes a list of merely factual features which do not clarify what the concept and the nature of substance really are. In the course of this discussion, we find an allusion to Aristotle's characterization of time as something belonging to motion, and to Aristotle's view that motion goes with the object in motion, kinesis to kinomeno. This is a very, very quick list of polemical arguments. Here Plotinus provides a very quick scrutiny of the ways in which Aristotle and the Peripatetics attempt to grasp substance and clarify its nature as a todity, or primary subject. Plotinus' point is that such characterizations do not really grasp the concept and the nature of substance. Within this context, the mention of time and motion is probably an allusion to Aristotle's physics. Plotinus' point is that Aristotle, so to speak, wrongly telescopes time into motion and motion into the thing in motion. Time is therefore regarded as something belonging to motion and motion as something belonging to the moved object, that is, to the sensible particular. In other words, Plotinus' polemical target is Aristotle's view that the particular substance is, so to speak, the main thing when we try to explain how things work in the corporeal world. Plotinus aims to dismantle this nexus, which makes all fundamental features of the physical world ultimately dependent on the bodily and particular thing on which they rest. From Plotinus' perspective, this approach turns the order of things upside down and prevents one from attaining a real understanding of essence, motion, and time, which come to be conceived of not in themselves, but as mere features or accidents inherent in bodies. In order to understand what essence, motion, and time really are, Aristotle's perspective must be reversed. And Plotinus' discussion aims to emphasize the weakness of Aristotle's perspective, thus showing that the sensible item moving in time has a secondary status, whereas essence, time, and motion are primary vis-à-vis their instantiations. In other words, the nature of essence, time, and motion must be explained, according to Plotinus, without referring to their factual existence in bodies. I think that these remarks help further understand why, at the beginning of 6.1.16, Plotinus does not specify that motion is an incomplete activity of the potential thing. Why Plotinus omits of the potential thing? His reinterpretation of Aristotle's formula energia teles and his distinction between motion in itself and the extension of motion aim precisely to make it possible to describe what motion is without including any reference to the thing in motion. This, however, leaves open the question of what exactly motion is activity of. Plotinus does not answer this question here. In 6.1.16, Plotinus does his best not to suggest that motion is an activity belonging to the thing in motion, without actually explaining very much about the metaphysical status of the activity itself. But the clarification is provided in 6.3. There, Plotinus, after explaining in 6.2 the structure of intelligible motion, turns to sensible being and to the genera proper to it. And this is a crucial move. Plotinus' criticism of Aristotle and the Stoics in 6.1 is basically developed as an internal criticism, and the metaphysical background is either cursorily mentioned or implicit. Plotinus merely wants to show that Aristotle's distinctions are not complete. They need something else. When it comes back to motion in bodies in 6.3, it doesn't say that motion is of the potential things. He says that motion is peri, in the things in motion. In other words, he outlines motion in bodies as the instantiation in bodies and not of bodies. Motion in bodies derived from an incorporeal power, and motion peri, motion in bodies, is the instantiation of this incorporeal power. You have the text number 11, where, of course, there is a crucial, I'm very skeptical. Sometimes there are some interpretations aiming at showing that Plotinus is, after all, consistent with Aristotle, even in 6.3. I am very skeptical because Plotinus' idea that if we start from dynamics, Plotinus is the instantiation in bodies of an incorporeal power, and that motion in itself is not connected to the features of bodies. So this overall view leads Plotinus to reject one key theory of Aristotle, that is that motion is divided according to the categories. Motion cannot be divided according to the categories because the categories are merely provisional limits of an activity which is a heterotes, as Plotinus says, and which derives from incorporeal causes. But we have this conclusion in 6.3, whereas 6.1 has only a preliminary function, so to speak. So I aim to show that Plotinus' critical discussion of Aristotle in 6.1 is, after all, consistent, that my ancient interpretation is not the correct one. Still, I think that some features of my old book can be saved after all. And I also aim to outline some features of Plotinus' reading of Aristotle in order to get clear about the real sense of Plotinus' criticism in 6.1. We have to read 6.3. That's a real problem. Those colleagues who focus on 6.1 do not really focus on 6.3. That's why their readings are, in my view, somewhat unsatisfying. Thank you very much.